Welcome back to the Innovative Agency, everybody. Sharon Toerek here with you again today, and got money on my mind for this conversation. And I'm guessing a lot of you who are running or who own agencies have that on your mind as well. Um, Depending on our production schedule here at the podcast, you're either going to be hearing this right at the end of 2025 or at the beginning of 2026 when you're thinking about your performance for this next year. And we're all thinking about revenue all the time as owners. And then profit is kind of something that feels like an afterthought for many of us, even though we know that it's the metric that matters in terms of building value in our companies if we ever want to move on from them or sell them, or how much we can take away at the end of the day as owners of the businesses. And I can't think of a better person to have a conversation about all of that with than my friend Marcel Petitpas, who is the owner and founder and CEO of Parakeeto. And it's their life's work to make your agency more profitable at the end of the day. I'm dumbing it down greatly, Marcel. I'm going to let you tell your story in a second. But first of all, thank you for being here. I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks for having me, Sharon. It's always a pleasure when we get a chance to hang out and chat.
It is always a pleasure, and usually we're kind of we're all about the presenting the content and the being the educators, and we don't usually get to have like a free form conversation like this during our times together. So um, let's start first of all. Share a little bit about Parakeeto and how it collaborates with agencies, and then I have so much I want to ask you about the work that you do.
Yeah. It's a great question. It's funny because we were talking before we hit record
Yep.
that this question comes at a moment where we're sort of trying to redefine how we talk about what it is that we do. Because historically, we've seen ourselves as being the first of our kind, doing something that's never really been done before. But I think to put it in layman's terms, you could think of us like the perfect combination between a fractional CFO and a fractional COO, specifically for boutique agencies that want to improve their profitability. And the reason that that's important is because profitability is the intersection of operations and finance. You can't really solve it with one or the other. You need the combination of the two. And anyone that's tried to solve that problem knows that it's difficult to do it yourself. And it's also difficult to find finance people that are willing to get in the weeds in operations, or operations people that have the financial acumen to go the other direction. And so that's really the space that we try to occupy and the problem that we try to solve when we work with clients.
So what made this problem matter to you, or what motivated you to try to solve this problem in this industry? I don't think we've ever had that
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, it's a great question. I did run a firm, a very small firm, very briefly early on in my career. It was
Mhm.
called Real Tours Media, and it's a horrible name, but we did virtual reality tours for real
Oh,
estate agents before you could do that with your iPhone.
right.
So we'd go into a house with a DSLR camera and a wide angle fisheye lens and this special gimbal, and we would take like 20 photos in one spot and then move the thing to another spot and take another 20 photos, and then take them back to the computer, turn those into 3D images, load them into a 3D modeling software, build a rendering of the house, and then you could tour it online or with a virtual headset on. And this was like back in 2015 before the tech for this was really good. And
Mm.
the issue that we ran into right away with that business, like super early on, was the realization that this took 30, sometimes 40 hours worth of labor to do between going to the house, taking all the photos, and then all the post production. And real estate agents were, at the time, it was a total buyer's market.
Mhm.
Houses were sitting on the market for sometimes years at a time. I'm in Eastern Canada, where the average price of a home is like 170 grand. And
Right.
so a real estate agent was not really willing to pay a lot of money for these kinds of assets to sell their homes. And so we were demanding a price point of, we were maxing out at a few $100 for, a ton of work. And it became very clear early on in that business that I would not have the unit economics to scale this into anything more than a hobby for myself. And
Hmm.
so I became familiar at that point in time with the massive discrepancy between revenue and profit, and how hard it actually was to answer simple questions like how profitable is this project or this job, and think about utilization and think about capacity and the complicated nature of that, especially if we weren't billing by the hour. And
Mhm.
so I got interested in technology and startups. And a few years later, a friend of mine gave me a call. He ran a much bigger agency than I ever ran. And he said, I've got this idea for a product that every agency owner I've ever spoken to needs. I spend several days a week in spreadsheets trying to answer these simple questions about my business. There has to be a better way to do it. So right away, I was interested. That summer, I spoke to probably 50 different agency owners about this, and every single one of them, once I pierced through the veil of them pretending they knew what they were doing in this part of their business, all of them admitted that they didn't. And so we're like, okay, this is a real problem. And at the time, we thought that this could be solved purely with software. And so we pre-sold software, and we spent the next 4 years essentially trying to be a software company until we eventually realized that this it's not just about software. There is a framework that's needed here. There's a process that's needed here. And we sort of pivoted into being more of a consulting firm that's leveraged by some tools that we've built to help us do this. So that's essentially the backstory and why we got involved. And that was 7 years ago that we got into this. And I've just become more and more passionate about this problem with every passing year. The deeper I get into it, the bigger and more important I think it becomes. And as the industry has changed, I just think it keeps getting more important. The pandemic made it more important as it made margins even harder to come by. And now AI is making it more important as that increases the value of having good, clean data and is creating even more margin pressure and even more pressure for agencies to change and be tight about their margins. And so, yeah, that's how we got to where we are.
It's so interesting to me that, well, a ton about what you and Parakeeto do is interesting to me, but what I was going to say is it's so interesting to me that we have so much more data at our fingertips, and it's so much more simple to access than it used to be about how to run agencies profitably.
Mm,
And it is no less difficult to do so today than it was when I built a firm that serves agencies, which is going on 15 years now. So,
yeah.
what do you think? Let's start with the low hanging fruit. What do you think most agency owners don't understand or ignore when it comes to profitability principles related to their agency?
hmm So it's interesting because I think that when people are experiencing this problem, they jump straight to sort of they try to wag the dog by the tail. They try to
Mhm,
wag the dog by the tail in that they kind of start at the end and then work their way back to the beginning. What I
mhm,
mean by that is they jump straight to, I need better accounting data and bookkeeping and finance reports. I need better time tracking data. And that's all those are the last steps to the process. And what
mhm,
they ignore and what they try to back into is the framework, right? And so the first question that needs to be asked is, well, how do I measure the performance of my business?
mhm,
What metrics do I pay attention to? How do I actually define those metrics? Right. So one example I use all the time is utilization. Ask 10 agencies what their utilization rate is. You get 10 different answers. Ask them how they define capacity and a billable hour. You get 10 different answers.
mm,
Right. So like that is problem number one. Until you answer that question of exactly what are the metrics, exactly how do we calculate them, exactly how do we define every object within every formula, and exactly how do we understand the relationship between that metric and our business, why it goes up, why it goes down, what the impact that is, and what the relationship is between all the metrics that we're tracking and each other, right?
mhm,
So if my utilization goes up, does that impact my gross margin? Does it impact my project profit? Like what is the relationship? We have to start there. And
right.
the vast majority of firms do not have a framework for how to measure their business. So that became, over the years, a really big, important part of what we've done and what we try to do is we've developed this framework. We've used it with hundreds of firms. We've tested every edge case you could imagine, and we try to make it publicly available through our tools and resources that we publish online, because that is the starting point. You can't really solve this problem no matter how much data you have, no matter how advanced your accounting and bookkeeping is, no matter how detailed your project planning is, until you know what you're trying to actually measure, it's not going to matter. So that's point number one.
Mhm. Do you see a lot of agencies, defaulting to the assumption that a profit issue is almost always a pricing issue? Because they're not always interchangeable, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah.
So talk about that a little bit, because I think
Hmm.
that's where a lot of agency owners might tend to go. Well, it's a pricing issue. We're not pricing well, or we're not pricing properly, or
Yeah.
we're doing time and materials and we should be doing project billing or whatever it is. But yeah.
Hmm. Yes, this is definitely a pattern. And so I'll zoom out. The first distinction that I think is important to make is it a starvation problem or is it an indigestion problem? And I think that most firms, if you think about the story arc of how they discover and eventually address their profitability problem, it usually starts as being framed as a starvation problem. And the way that that manifests is they go out and close a bunch of new work, and then their team gets overwhelmed, and then they roll up their sleeves and go help their team out. And then they're like, oh shit, I got to hire some more people. So they hire more people to get themselves out of the weeds again. And then all of a sudden they get those people hired and trained, and they're like, oh crap, we need some more work. So they go back to selling and they sell more work. And just as it starts to feel like there's enough revenue and enough clients and everything's okay again, their team gets busy and overwhelmed. And they're like, oh shit, I got it back in the weeds again. And this cycle sort of repeats itself over and over and over again until one day they wake up and they're like, wait a second, am I ever going to outgrow this problem? And
Hmm.
they start to recognize, like, oh, wait a second, maybe it's not a starvation problem. Maybe it's not that we don't have enough clients and revenue, and because we have in some cases 7, 8, 9 figures of revenue and this problem is still coming up. Maybe it's an indigestion problem. Maybe there's something wrong with the way we collected all of revenue from the client, earn it by doing the promise that we made to them, run the business and pay for the overhead, that's not leaving us with enough profit. Maybe the problem is somewhere in the middle. It has to do with the operations of the business. It's not a finance problem, it's an operations problem. That is the precursor to financial performance. And so once you move to operations, there are essentially four reasons that an agency might not be profitable. The
Hmm.
first one is that they're spending too much on overhead. And that is almost never the problem, but way too many people index towards that as the assumption. And it's usually a byproduct of the data they're looking at. Their P&L is usually structured in such a way that it misleads them to think they have an overhead problem. When
Hmm.
it's, I could tell you, out of the hundreds of firms that we've looked at, I could count on my two hands the number of firms that had an actual overhead problem. Almost none of them have an overhead problem. It's very rare. So if you rule that out, and assuming that it is your problem, that's the easiest thing to solve. You just cut some
Hmm.
expenses.
Hmm.
You find cheaper tools. You cut the fat. You go through your P&L with a Sharpie, and you cross out anything that isn't essential. You cut you go figure out that you have 50 extra seats on this software that you're paying for that you don't need. Like, you
Right.
cut overhead. It's not that hard. The harder thing to do is addressing the real problem for most firms, which is your delivery margin is not high enough. And I'm going to describe delivery margin. When you hear this, you might think, oh, that sounds the same as gross margin. And maybe that is for you, but I don't want to use accounting terms because I'm really, really sick of having semantic arguments about what gross margin is and what COGS are. And like, I don't care.
You are not going to get an accounting semantics argument from this interviewer. I promise you.
I
I hated
I'm sure
accounting.
I'm sure I won't, but I don't want anybody listening at home that has a finance background to tune out. So the
Got it.
concept with delivery margin is essentially, what is the margin that you make after you have earned the revenue that your clients have paid you? And it's a function of how much did you get paid
Right.
after stripping out what we would consider pass-through expenses, right? So money that you collect that wasn't yours to begin with. That's the
Right.
media budget, it's the print budget, it's the travel budget, it's the outsourced video production firm that you'll never do video production, you always outsource that, right? So after you strip all that out and you retain whatever wasn't an expense that passed through you and whatever markup you applied to those things, that gets you what we call AGI, or agency gross income, which is a term that Drew at AMI really popularized. And
Right.
then what we want to look at next to that is, what was the cost of the delivery function of your business in a given time period? And the margin between those two things is your delivery margin. So as an example, if you collected $1 million in AGI and you spent $400,000 on the payroll and the software and the management overhead for your delivery team specifically during that time period, then you would have had a 60% delivery margin, meaning you spent 40 cents of every dollar that clients paid you to deliver on the promise that you made to them. And you have 60% of that dollar left over now to pay for overhead and hopefully have a profit. And the
Got it.
target for delivery margin is generally 50% as the floor. The reason for that is you're usually going to spend another 20 to 30% on overhead. So if you want to plan to have a 20 to 30% profit, you kind of need to keep at least 50 cents of every dollar after the work has been done.
Hmm.
So the vast, vast, vast majority of firms that we work with, their issue is that they do not have high enough delivery margin, and it is due to really only three reasons, three levers that you can use to influence that. So before I get into that, I'm going to pause and hydrate and let you say some things because I could just keep talking about this, as you know.
No, this is fascinating. And look, any professional service firm, including the one that I run, which is not an agency, needs to know this stuff because you can build what I call your SKU, how much you think it's going to cost to deliver a service. And if you're not hitting that number and you're not economizing in other ways, and like client acquisition, or then the numbers that you see, they just don't make sense to you. And you just don't
Mhm.
understand why in your gut you cannot feel the results that the numbers on the page or screen are telling you are true. So this is
Yeah.
important stuff to know. And um, eh, what do you think causes the gap in understanding around all of this? I know you haven't gotten through your framework yet, but I
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
curious.
It's a great question. And I think the first big thing is that this hasn't historically been talked about a lot.
Hmm.
Like I remember when I first came in the industry, it was really hard to find any information about like what any of these metrics, first of all, should be, let alone what the benchmarks were, let alone what the relationship between them were. And then I think what also compounds that is the vast majority of firms are basically just looking at a P&L at the end of every month that's not structured to give them any of this information. It's
Right.
probably not on accrual accounting. And if it is on accrual accounting, it's probably some really crappy version of accrual accounting that's not actually reflective of earned value. So it's
Hmm.
just using invoice dates, which in my opinion is just a shittier version of cash accounting. It's far less useful and it's not accurate for really any purpose at all. And
None taken.
yeah, yeah. And yeah, you can tell I have strong opinions about this.
Yes, I do.
And then on top of that, they look at their P&L and L and it's like there's income. Maybe they're using COGS to isolate pass-through expenses. That's common. It's not a problem. That's just a thing. And
Hmm.
then all of their expenses, including all of their payroll and all of their hard expenses, are just in this big kind of category called OPEX. And so the question of what is actually the problem is very unclear because they don't know what their delivery margin is. In order to know that, you would have to differentiate between payroll that's for overhead and payroll that's for delivery. Well, that's a
Hmm.
lot of extra work for some accountants, and most of them don't even really understand that concept. And
Right.
so the information that they're looking at is not, it's not giving them this. The people that they're speaking to are often in a very transactional relationship of I'm going to do your bookkeeping, I'm going to give you the P&L, and then we're going to file your taxes at the end of the year. And they're not there to understand their business, get deep into the weeds of operations, and actually be able to accurately and precisely diagnose like why is your business running the way that it is? How much profit could you possibly generate with this business? What should you be focused on? What next steps can you take? Like that's just not part of the scope. And there's very few people that actually have that expertise as well. They're either finance people or they're ops people, but they're not in the middle. It kind of comes back to the position that
Right.
we have. So I think for all those reasons, most agency owners don't get support on this, and it usually is not the reason they started their business in the first place. They don't have a background in this. They're subject matter experts, and so without this information being presented to them, they're just not really going to get it until things get so bad that a designer goes looking for blog posts on agency finance, and then things are really dire.
Yeah, yeah, that the world is coming to an end when your design team is looking for finance information
Yeah.
to help you run your business more profitably. I agree with that 100%. Do you think part of this, and this just honestly just popped into my head as we were having this last point of discussion. Do you think part of this is legacy based on the fact that I don't know, before either you or I were serving agencies, but as recently as maybe 20 or 15 years ago, agencies didn't have to care about this because they were
Yep.
throwing off so much money
Yes.
in media commissions that the profitability of the rest of the business wasn't even something they lost any sleep over. I'm wondering if that is
Mhm.
still lingering over and causing the lack of depth of understanding in this area for agencies.
Yes, I think you've touched on something really important, and there's two factors that I think are critical here. The first is, yes, the margins in the industry have been getting increasingly compressed. And so the room for error is smaller and smaller all the time. And I have
Mhm.
a visual, there's an article on our website called Our Point of View. And there's a graph that I draw, which is like margins over time going down, level of sophistication required to run an agency going up. And
Mm.
we are kind of at the crossing point where it's like you used to just be able to like be a designer or a marketer or like a great strategist or an ad person and just be extremely talented and like make a ton of mistakes and still be making lots of money because there was so much margin. It was very forgiving.
Yeah.
That is not the case anymore. So just like if you were going to go be the CEO of an airline, right? You have a
Right.
3% margin if you're lucky to play with.
Hmm.
That's a razor thin margin for error. So you better know your numbers and be wildly on top of them because a slight oversight could mean that the whole thing goes insolvent. We're
Hmm.
not there yet in agency, but that is the way that we've been going. And I think what has really made this acute is the pandemic was a massive increase in margin pressure because it both shot the cost of onshore labor up by 30 or 40% in most of the
Yeah.
skilled disciplines, while also completely democratizing this skill set across the world and creating global competition almost overnight. And
Right.
so you have this lower expectation of price from clients and this much higher cost of onshore labor. That was very disruptive. And now, just as we're getting our feet under us, AI has entered the chat and it's compounding this whole thing on top of itself again. And so I think we've made probably like 20 years of maturity as far as like margin pressure in the industry in the last 5 or 6. So
Right.
that's point one. And then point two, I think, is the displacement of time materials billing, which most of the best practices, accounting principles, and technology were all hard coded to. And that way of billing, which was the predominant way of billing across all professional services for like centuries,
Hmm.
is no longer common. But the assumption in the past was you sell the work, you do the work, you track the time, and then at the end, it's inherently retroactive. Finance cleans all this up. So it's a very linear flow of information.
Right.
But today, with most firms doing lots of different pricing models, lots of different staffing models, there is far more complexity. And the old tools are just not really wired to an
Yeah.
infrastructure that accounts for that complexity. So a
Yeah.
lot of the stuff is actually just like broken. The tools just don't exist.
I can see that. And I think um I think legacy hangover, if you will, just in terms of the way the business models have changed, along with a proliferation of tools, not necessarily meaning that a typical agency owner is going to know the right combination of ones to use to give them the data that they need to actually make a meaningful change in their business so that they're taking more home at the end of the day. Um, I also think, and I want to get your perspective on this because you're the profitability expert here. Um, you said a couple minutes ago that it's almost never an overhead issue.
Mhm.
How often do agency owners mistakenly assume that it is a pricing issue? And what kind
Yeah.
of issue, if they do, what kind of problems does that cause?
Yeah, very often. So we're going to come back to, and there's going to be some people are going to be so relieved about this because we left 3 open boxes earlier, and now we
Oh,
now we
okay.
now we
Well,
get to
let's
go
go
back and
ahead. Go
close them,
ahead. Let's
right?
go through your
So
boxes. We'll
so
come
we
back.
talked about delivery margin.
Got it.
There's only 3 reasons that your delivery margin would be poor, and it's really a combination of any 3 of the levers that move delivery margin. So the first is that your average cost per hour is too high, meaning you spend too much on labor relative to what you can charge. And so you don't
Okay.
have enough margin. So one way to resolve that is to, on an operational level, focus on decreasing the average cost per hour of the things that you do. And you do that by looking, as if you want to get really precise, breaking down sort of task by task, like who's doing this work and where do we have opportunities to take someone that costs $150,000 a year and get that work done by someone who costs 50. And to the degree that you can do that over time, what you should find is that your revenue grows at a faster rate than your costs, because instead of constantly hiring $150,000 people, you hire fewer of those and more $50,000 people. And of course, if you have contractors on your team, you'll feel that change a lot more quickly. So
Right.
that's point number one. Point number two is utilization. So most firms are predicated on this concept of they go find talented people, they give them guaranteed income for usually about 2,000 hours of their life per year. and then they try to monetize a high percentage of that 2,000 hours by reselling it to a client and taking the profit margin. That's the entire business model of any
Right.
service-based company, right? You're buying
Right.
time in bulk from people, and then you're trying to resell that at a profit. And that should be in a creative relationship for everybody that's involved. Everybody wins if that transaction is done properly. But of course, if you hire a whole bunch of people and then you can't resell their work, well, you're still going to have to pay them for the time because that was the agreement.
Hmm.
And you're not going to monetize it. And therefore, you're not spending a high enough percentage of your time earning revenue. So utilization is kind of the second main piece. It might not be high enough. There might not be a high enough percentage of the time being used to earn money, and or you're paying for a whole bunch of capacity that's just not actually generating revenue. And then the third one is average billable rate. So this is looking at, for every hour of time your team does spend doing work for clients, on average, how much revenue does that earn for the business? And that
Hmm.
is independent of billing model. Doesn't matter how you charge them. Could be value-based, flat rate, percent of ad spend, hourly, trident layers, doesn't matter. The formula is how much money did we make and how many hours did we spend doing the work. You divide that and it tells you effectively for every hour of effort, how much money did we make? And this is
Hmm.
an interesting metric because you can look at different projects, different clients, different service types, et cetera. So the way to improve that number, and this is the one that people get fixated on, there's two ways to improve it. Either they can increase their price without increasing the scope.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, if they're struggling to increase their hourly rate, that's when they start to say, oh, well, maybe we decouple these things. Maybe we go to flat or value-based pricing, or we add some abstraction. Maybe we go to day or week or month rates, or we go to cross-functional team rates, right? There's ways to sort of incrementally decouple these things.
Right.
And that is a path. But the other side of that equation is, if you're already decoupled from time, spend less time doing the same thing. And that
Hmm.
has the same impact. Theoretically, if you can cut the time in half, you can do twice as much revenue with the same team and therefore be more than
Right.
twice as profitable.
Right. Right. Right.
And so to answer your question, the vast majority of firms do believe that they are underpricing. And some of them are, but not nearly as many as they think that that's the issue. The dangerous thing with pricing increases is that they will solve the problem, even if that's not actually the problem. And if nothing else, they'll take some pressure off in the short term, right? But
Hmm.
you can price yourself out of a utilization problem. I actually just saw this yesterday. I was on a call with a client and they
Okay.
thought their issue was pricing and that they weren't efficient enough at doing the work. And after talking to them, I was like, your effective like average cost per hour is $45. Your effective hourly rate is $440. You do not have a problem with your project margins. Your
Yeah.
projects are all incredibly profitable. You're obviously pricing very well and you're very efficient at getting the work done. Their
Yeah.
issue was their utilization was like 25%,
Um,
right?
so it
But
didn't matter if their effective rate or recovery rate was 400 plus an hour because they weren't able to
exactly.
capitalize on all that available inventory.
And this is the trap, right? Is like in that business, every single project that they're doing is obviously a home run. That doesn't mean the business is going to be profitable. Project profitability is not, you can't infer the profitability of the business from profitability of projects. And you shouldn't try to do that. Actually, they're related, but they're not interchangeable.
Hmm.
So their problem was, yeah, like their team was only spending 25% of their time doing client work and the other 75% was not earning money. So if they
What
were
were they
even
doing? What were they doing with that time? I'm very curious, and I think listeners would be very curious to know.
right. So this is where you start to get into the operations side of the consulting,
Yeah.
right? Because it's like, okay, we know that that's the problem, but then how do you fix it? And it's like, well, what are all the reasons that their utilization wasn't where it needed to be? Well, so the first thing we have to figure out is, well, what is the ceiling for this team? And so the way you have to get to that answer is you go through every person on the team and you figure out, okay, well, how many hours do we pay them for? 40 for most of these folks. And then where do I expect their time to go if we had
Mhm.
unlimited client work to do? And what we found out was this firm was actually designed such that their ceiling was only 39%. So while 25% feels low relative to their ceiling, there's a gap there, but it's not crazy actually.
Mhm.
So they're already a little bit top heavy. But again, when I looked at their model, I was like, well, if you were even at only 35%, your EBITDA would be like 40%. So
Mhm.
you have priced yourself into a place where you have the luxury of having low utilization. That's
Right.
fine. And like, I'm not here to tell you that that's wrong. You have earned it.
Right.
Right. But that was the first thing, was like, is this a structural problem in that they're actually maxed out. They just don't know it because they've never evaluated, well, what is the ceiling for our utilization actually? This is a
Mm.
trap a lot of firms fall into, is they talk to their buddies at a cocktail party and they're like, oh yeah, we're 95% utilized. And there's no discussion about, well, how do you define capacity? How do you define a billable hour? Turns out that firm takes all their time off out of capacity and considers working on the company website billable. So like that's a meaningless number. And
Got
so
it.
they go back to their shop and they're like, oh, I'm going to use this arbitrary external benchmark with no context. And then I'm going to evaluate my own utilization based on that. That's not a
Mhm.
useful exercise. So first step, is it structural? No, it wasn't structural. So then the question was, well, does your team feel busy? And in some cases they did, but I think we both agreed, like, no, if we brought on more clients, there would be room for them to take it on. But in some cases, she said, yeah, there are parts of the team that are really busy. So then we went through the list of like things that might be going on here. So the first was, maybe there's some people on your team that have some context dilution. So what I mean by that is they're spread out across 15 different clients at a time. So even if they're only 50% billable, it feels like they're maxed out, because
Okay.
that is far more stressful than spending all of your time on one project. Right. So I've
Right.
seen developers that are logging 40 billable hours a week that are not stressed at all because they're just on the same project every single day. They clock in, they do the same thing. And then there's the account manager that's only 35% billable, but they're balancing 50 different clients and they feel completely overwhelmed. So,
Yeah.
number
Law
one,
firms have this issue too. I mean, there's code switching, there's matter type switching there all day long. So
yeah.
I can feel this in my bones when I hear you saying it.
So that's a huge one, is context solution. The next one that we wanted to look at was, of course, resource planning and forecasting. And the culprit there that we see is, if there are really significant peaks and valleys, the peaks are going to color the sentiment of the team as opposed to where they actually land in utilization. So we had a client, really good example of this. They did a ton of video work. They would go from being like essentially 0% utilized for a couple of weeks to everybody working 100 hours a week for the
Oh.
following 2 weeks, because they're on site on shoot days for 16 hours at a time, and it's pre-pro and it's post-pro and it's like super intense. And then they would go back to having nothing to do,
Mhm.
and they felt completely overworked because when they were redlining, they were like really redlining, right? They
Mhm.
were like cutting to the bone, flying too close to the sun. And so even though in the end they only ended up at like 50%, their perspective was colored by the extremity of the peaks. And so for that firm, it was about trying to level out their utilization
Yeah,
and do a
wow.
better job of spreading work out, of doing resource planning, so that was an operational project in nature. So that's another one that's important to consider. The second one is load balancing. So we had another client, their design team looked underutilized. When we double clicked on it, we found that there was two designers that were like completely maxed out, and then everybody else was barely busy at all. And
Mm.
so, they were there was all kinds of reasons for that. They were like far better than the other
Right.
designers. There was also some training and development issues. There was a lack of clarity. There were some issues with bottlenecks in the workflow. But like in that case, we couldn't take the utilization at face value. There was just like a bottleneck in the process. Another client, for example, that we had recently, their design team was maxed and everybody else wasn't busy. And what we figured out was, well, the other team can't do their work until the design team's done their backlog. And so we actually had to hire someone in design to increase the throughput to increase everybody else's utilization, which is very
Mhm.
counterintuitive. So
Right.
load balancing is another one. And then another important one to consider is dependencies and synchronicity. So there are instances where the work is there, but you're blocked from doing it because there was a meeting with 8 stakeholders that keeps getting rescheduled because there's 8 stakeholders on that meeting. And so it's like
Yeah.
a massive risk. And the way that we've set up our project, we've created a dependency there that might mean that a designer that was waiting to do that work now has nothing to do for a week because that's gotten rescheduled and there's not
Mhm.
other work to pull forward, or the way that they have to do that work requires synchronicity, so it has to be done in real time with somebody else, and that coordination becomes more challenging and difficult. So that's another sort of operational thing in nature, but you could find that you have demand, but you're gated from being able to utilize your team because of these operational issues. So there's a whole bunch of stuff like that that we would then sort of have to work through to figure out, okay, what is holding your team back from getting to this utilization ceiling that we know is reasonable? What is the operational issue?
Got it. So, all right. So we talked about utilization and then different ways and factors
Yeah.
that you've got to consider. to go at that problem and why it's so important to walk through those for your agency, because I think the knee-jerk reaction in a lot of these cases is, well, our pricing just doesn't make sense. Our
Yeah.
our business model doesn't make sense. We should be value billing and we're not, or we should be doing X and we're doing Y. And it's really, we haven't looked at any of the things you just walked us through.
Yeah. I think that nuanced approach is important too, because like this was actually the whole conversation I had with this client. They came in thinking like their insecurity was, are we charging enough? Do we need to be more efficient? Like they thought it was a project profitability problem.
Mm-hmm.
And to be fair, they could have just kept pricing their, like they could have kept increasing their price until the 25% utilization didn't matter anymore. But
Mm-hmm.
that was going to be really hard because they were already starting to feel some, like they had done such a good job of this that they were kind of like really at the edge of what they could charge. They were feeling
Yeah.
some resistance. They were struggling with, like clients being priced out. And it's so much easier in their instance and so much faster to solve this utilization issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, I think this is where I just get frustrated because people come to me and they've either been fed this sort of dogmatic narrative that we have in our industry from pricing experts where increase your price is the hammer and everyone's a nail.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the problem that's applied in a blanket way. Or they've just come off a conversation with their accountant where they're like, you're overstaffed based on this incredibly reductionist P&L that I'm looking at.
Mm-hmm.
And then they go back to their team. Their team's like, what are you talking about? We're understaffed. You need to hire 5 people yesterday. We're crazy busy. And then they're like, great. What the hell's going on? Right. I just have
Right.
no insight.
So I'm curious about communication around all this, because I'm going to take a guess that part of the pain of an agency owner or leader in actionalizing some of the great advice you're giving us here is, how
Mhm.
do I explain this internally if it's truly an operational factor and we need to change it, but we need the right vocabulary or story to tell about why. And I'm also interested in, what's the communication process like with the clients when it actually might be a business model or a pricing problem, and you have to have that difficult conversation with clients. Like, our next work scope's going to be dramatically, you know, priced at an increase because we're bleeding here, based
Yeah.
on the way we're pricing you so far. So talk a little bit about the communications that have to go along with all these operational implementations that you just walked us through.
Mhm. So to frame up this, I'll talk about what I think the 3 ingredients for what I call profit management are. And they are
Mhm,
framework, which we talked about earlier, know what you're measuring, data, have the data available to be able to measure those things. And then the last one that gets super overlooked is process. And process really has 3 pillars to it. It's hygiene, it's cadences, and it's change. Right.
mhm.
So I think so many of the softwares and tools and BI dashboards out there assume things that are just like ridiculous. For example, the data is going to be clean. The data is never clean. It's never been clean. It's never going to be clean. Like the team, like it's just not going to be clean. Right.
Yeah,
So why are we assuming that we can just like Zapier this into a dashboard and then no, it's going to be garbage in, garbage out. The
right.
second is that change isn't going to occur. Like, but we're going to change the tools. We're going to change how we use them. We're going to change how we structure things. We're going to change the naming conventions. We're going to change what we sell. We're going to change the pricing model. We're going to change the staffing. All this stuff is going to change.
Mhm,
And so again, these tools are rigid and they assume that there's not going to be change. So you end up, well, I can't compare this year to last year because the structure is completely different. And then
right.
the last piece is cadences, which is like, well, we have this meeting every week to talk about this number, but the way our process works, we don't get that data until the week after, right? So what is the utility of that information if it's not actually supporting the conversations and decisions we're making? So,
Mhm,
around communication, I think that's where we start, right? Is like, these are the 3 ingredients. We need to understand what we're trying to measure and why. We need to make sure we have the data that's available. And then we need to have the process in place to make sure that we have this data when we're talking about this stuff as a team,
mhm,
right? So where are our gaps in all of this? And I think importantly, recognizing that like it is not realistic to expect the finance person to completely own this or the operations person to completely own this. This is
mhm,
not fully within their scope. This happens sort of at the intersection of those things. And it is hard and it's complicated and it's not necessarily a reasonable expectation for any one person on the executive team to hold responsibility for that, especially in a boutique firm. So that's the first thing I'll say on that. The second
Okay.
question that you asked was communication. What was the second question?
Well, I think you kind of addressed the first part of it, which was communicating it internally, and you kind of walked
Right.
through that. The conversation that needs to happen with the client
Right.
when
Right.
the
Right.
pricing and the business modeling and the work scoping does legit have to change.
Yeah. Yeah. So I like to look at this as 3 R's. And this is again where there's nuance. First of all, you might not want to have that conversation if your utilization is low, right? So not all contexts are created equal. There's a good time to start cleaning up your project profitability, and there's a bad time to do it. And it's also
Mhm.
worth noting that even if project profitability is your biggest problem, it doesn't mean it's the only way for you to make progress on profitability. If utilization is also a problem, you want to fix utilization first. So
Okay.
sequencing matters here. And the reason I say that is if your utilization is low, even if that project is not great, it's still better than nothing.
Right.
Unless, of course, you're willing to fire that client and fire all the people who are doing the work. But if you're
Mhm.
not willing to do that, you will not be better off, even if a project is crappy, right? Because would you rather sell an hour for $0 or $1? Well, the
Right.
answer is obviously $1. So
Right.
step one is increase utilization. So there's like more nuance to this than just like go raise your price. And then
Yeah.
once your utilization is maxed out, the framework we use is recapture, rescope, replace. So recapture is where a client is getting a lot more than what they're paying for. You go to them and you say, hey, there's all this additional scope that has emerged, and we're
Mhm.
concerned that we don't really have an arrangement that allows us to meet all these expectations that you have going forward. So let's propose a new way of working together. And the trick there is if you can try to repackage things as well. It's
Right.
kind of like shrinkflation, where it's like you don't really notice that the thing has gotten more expensive because it's in a different package now, or it's like a slightly different size, right? So it's not
My
the same.
cereal box is
Yeah,
6 ounces big now, and it used to be
yeah,
16. Yeah.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
It's different number of grams. So anyway, I digress. So that's recapture. If they're not willing to pay more, then you say, hey, I understand you have budgetary constraints. Why don't we talk about how to fit the scope into the budget that you have so that we're aligned and we can make sure that we're delivering on these expectations. And if they're not willing to do either of those things, and you go, no problem. And you wait until you're maxed out on utilization and the next client is going to be like, oh, do we need to go hire some people? And then you go to that client and say, hey, I'm afraid that we're just really not the right fit to support you going forward, and we want to introduce you to another partner that can
Mhm.
be more aligned to your expectations going forward. We actually had an agency that we worked with. They monetized their churn. They got a referral kickback when a client fired them and they referred them to the partner. They'd actually get paid for it. It was brilliant. So you do that, and then you bring in
Call
the
that
new
a
client.
strategic alliance, Marcel, and there's a
Correct.
specific kind of contract to put yourself into to handle those the
Yeah,
situations.
and I know a
Got it.
great lawyer that can help you write that up.
Yes.
Um,
Well, thank you.
and and so that's kind of the big idea, right? Is like recapture. If that doesn't work, try to rescope. If that doesn't work, wait until you're at that point where you might need to hire if you get another client, and then replace that client. And therefore you have increased your revenue, increased your profit, but you haven't increased your costs. And when you are fully utilized or you're getting close to your ceiling, that is the best time to start taking that newest client and leveraging it to go through your client list from bottom to top. And what you'll find is the vast majority will agree to the new terms. You just happen to be in a position where you actually have the leverage to confidently have that conversation.
Mhm. Well, and, ideally, the vigilance around the right data and collecting it and understanding it gives you sort of the courage, if you will, to have those conversations with the clients without feeling like you're dealing from a position of fear about losing business that you need to be sustainable as a firm, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
'Cause
Yeah.
I think ultimately that fear is at the bottom of what most agency owners do or don't do when it comes to fixing their profitability. Some of
Yeah.
it's lack of knowledge, but then some of it's fear, right? Fear of what it's gonna mean for people who are part of their team, fear about having the conversation with the client who, may be a long-term relationship or may represent a feather in their cap for other reasons, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So if you can arm yourself as an owner with the tools to take away, some of that, emotion, that level of emotion around it, most specifically the fear around it, it's easier to tackle um, the numbers, right?
Yeah. Yep. And I think a lot of, not to get too sort of philosophical with this, but I think a lot of people also have an emotional relationship with pricing and money and asking for things, especially if they're still sort of in an ownership position or a
Yep.
founding position, and they're still involved in business development and these pricing conversations. There could be a lot of sort of identity and personal net worth tied in this. And so what we found is that for some of our clients, giving them a formula that just tells them point blank, like this is enough and this is not enough, it sort of helps them take some of that off of themselves. Like it gives them an objective thing to point to, and it sort of relieves them of all this emotional pressure of
Mhm.
like, this is not about asking for what you're worth, or this is not about like, are you good enough to commit? It's like, this is just like what the math says,
Right,
and it's not up to you.
right,
And it's liberating for them in some ways to just have an objective framework that gets everybody on the same page about like, is this price enough or not
right.
to support the business model? That's a whole other discussion, but one that we have some great
No,
free
I mean
resources on.
it is a mindset exercise as much as it is an operation or a financial affairs exercise, but and the mindset is important, but I think the mindset's easier to level out on if you have the other things closer to optimal, right, than not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I don't want to miss an opportunity to take a look around the corner with where you, as a profitability and operations expert for agencies, see this going, given all the dynamism, let's put it that way, in the industry right now between
Yeah.
the economy, tariffs, AI. I mean, we've never seen, well, maybe we have, but I've never seen this much coming together at the same time to impact our client industry. And so, what do you
Yeah.
think this means about either new rules when it comes to looking at profitability or new things that agency owners need to be thinking about? And how are you evolving at Parakeeto to sort of talk to agencies about, how you fit into all this and in terms of the way that you interact with them and help them?
Yeah. This is a great question. And it forces me to sort of expose a dirty little secret about our business and about our entire philosophy, which is that we didn't really invent almost anything about like the fundamental way that we approach solving this problem outside of the framework. And I would argue that I don't know that we invented that framework. We'd certainly borrowed a lot of it from our predecessors, and we just sort of like took it to another level and tested it against a lot more edge cases. But the fundamental business thesis behind Parakeeto is we're just taking something called data operations, which is an entire function in enterprise companies, and their
Mhm.
job, it's usually made up of teams of data engineers and data analysts and data scientists. Their entire job is collect data from all over the organization, because these enterprise software companies have, or these enterprise companies have all kinds of software and all kinds of data being created in all kinds of places, and it's all super messy and unstructured. They bring it together and build out what they call a data pipeline, which is where the data comes in, and then it goes usually through an ELT or ETL process, which stands for extract, load, and transform. Right. So you extract the data from all these different places that it is, you load it into usually a data lake or a data lake house, or, there's all kinds of different technical terms for this stuff. And then you transform it. And the transform step is incredibly important. It's like you clean it up, you normalize it, you take care of all of the edge cases where it's like the dates are formatted in 50 different ways and all these 50 different softwares. There's little simple stuff like that. And then stuff of like, there's information missing, or there's like, anyway, there's an infinite amount of data issues, and we run into them all the time. And then once you have all of that done, then you start to apply business logic to it. You start to visualize it, right? And historically, enterprises have been doing this for a really long time, and they spend tons of money on this. And since AI has become a thing, they're spending way more money on it. Because if you talk to any AI engineering firm, services firm, the first thing that they'll start with is data. And
Mhm.
so enterprise, I've never seen this much money pouring into data infrastructure, data engineering, data hygiene in enterprise as is
Right,
happening right now, because everyone realizes the only way to get value out of AI with our data is for our data to be clean
right.
and more timely and more accurate. Now, here's the problem. You mentioned earlier, agencies and small businesses, we have more tools than we've ever had. I think the average small business has 70 software tools. The
Mhm.
amount of data that those tools are creating is going through the roof. It's compounding at an exponential rate. The cost of creating that data is lower than it's ever been. but our ability to extract value from it has not really changed at all.
Mm-hmm.
So my whole thesis with Parakeeto is the best practices that enterprise has been using to deal with large volumes of data are going to come down market to small businesses. The
Mm-hmm.
issue is we don't have tools for this. We don't have best practices, and we certainly can't afford to go hire a team of data engineers and data scientists to do this for us.
Mm-hmm.
So what we've tried to do is package this up, apply a very opinionated framework to it, very opinionated business logic, and build out a set of tools that allow us to make this best practice available to small firms. And so it's not the answer that anybody wants to hear, but I think that small businesses are going to have to start building data pipelines if they really want to make use of all of this AI and get all of this value. And that is going to, in the same way that it's seen as like a fundamental must have function in your business if you run an enterprise company, it
Mm-hmm.
will eventually become seen as a similar thing in small business. And I would think about this as being similar to like how most small businesses today are going to have something like a Zapier or a Make,
Mm-hmm.
in the background of a lot of their
Right.
processes. I think that kind of tooling and that kind of thinking is going to become important for small businesses as it relates to data. And they're going to start building out these little data infrastructures, but it's going to take a completely different set of tools and services because we can't be going and using the enterprise software. It's not built for this. So
Yeah.
that's the vacuum that I believe exists, and I believed existed 7 years ago, and I think is just like even more important than it's been. And that's really why we use that approach at Parakeeto when we build out our client systems. It's why we can do it without asking them to change any of their softwares or disrupt any of their existing workflows. And it's
Mm-hmm.
why it's so resilient to change, and it's actually durable over time. And so a lot of our focus is on continuing to get better at that, continuing to invest in building better technology for that, and making the data that produces more available to use, with AI, so that we can empower people to get better, faster insights. But
Right.
the fundamental problem is the clean data, and that's not an easy problem to solve.
It's so interesting because I think most agencies, when ChatGPT sort of democratized like almost 3 years ago, I think the first thing agencies first panicked and then started thinking more rationally about, in my view, is how are we going to use the generative side of AI in creating the stuff and replicating the things that we deliver to clients, right? That was kind of phase one. And then phase two is sort of where it's kind of where I feel like we are now, which is how do we use AI to, internally in our back office functions and but what you're talking about is sort of step three, and which is, I think, fitting because we've been talking about things in sets of threes the entire interview. I don't know if you noticed that or not, but I do this myself when I talk, so I've noticed you do it too. Step three is using all the data that AI can now help us assimilate more quickly, um, and making sure of the hygiene of it so that we can make smart decisions about our profitability, right? As businesses and agencies. So fascinating stuff. So, as fearful as some of you out there are, who are listening about what AI is going to mean for your business, it also seems to hold a little bit of the secret sauce in it in terms of making your businesses more profitable. And not for the reasons that you usually think of, i.e., we can turn around our work faster, or, we might be able to hire fewer people because we can automate some stuff. You can also use it to actually get you the information and help you interpret the information you need so that you're taking more money home at the end of the day from the agency's business, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a huge opportunity. The asterisk on all of that, of course, is you have to give it good information. And I think this is the fundamental
Yeah.
problem, right? If it's like, if you're just getting like a cash-based P&L from your accountant that's not differentiating between delivery and operations and overhead functions, for example, then like,
Hmm.
what is the AI going to tell you? It's going to tell you the same thing your accountant told you, which is you're overstaffed, which is inconsistent with your daily experience, and then you get nowhere. And so
Right.
I wish that was a problem that AI was going to magically fix. Unfortunately, it's not, but it creates an opportunity, in my opinion, for the
Right.
firms that understand this and get ahead of it. They will have an edge, and they will be able to move a lot faster. And that's the reason you're seeing enterprise pour a crazy amount of money into data infrastructure right now. They all know that's the foundation on which they will have an advantage with this technology going forward.
I think that's a fabulous mic drop moment. And I feel like I get smarter every time I talk to you, and today's been no exception, and I'm sure everybody listening feels similarly. So I want to thank you for sharing sort of your story behind what motivated you to establish Parakeeto and how it's helping agencies and how you're evolving your approach to helping agencies in light of everything that's changing in their world. I want to give you an opportunity to tell folks how to find Parakeeto, and we'll also drop some links into some of the free resources that I know you so generously make available at
Yeah.
Parakeeto for agencies to get more education about some of this stuff. So where are some of the best places?
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you for having me. And the pleasure is all mine. For
Thanks.
those that have listened, you want to dive deeper into all of this stuff. First, if you're a podcast listener, which you might be if you're listening to this, we have a show called the Agency Profit Podcast. You'll never guess what we talk about on that show. Sharon has been a guest multiple times, so
Yeah.
check that out. We also have free tools at parakeeto.com. We have a ton of content. We also have the toolkit. You can find that at parakeeto.com/toolkit, which
Mhm.
is basically the 20% of information you need to get 80% of the visibility into your agency and go a lot deeper on all the concepts I talked about today. And that's completely free at no cost. And then, of course, if you want to just connect with me, LinkedIn is probably the best place to do that. And, I try to check my DMs when I can a few times a week and answer questions and nerd out. So feel free to reach out there. I'd love to hear from you.
Amazing. And if any of you have an opportunity to see some of the content that Marcel delivers, whether he collaborates with a ton of folks in the industry on webinars, on podcasts, if you have a chance to see him live at an agency conference, take advantage of it because the value is powerful every single time. So, Marcel, thanks for joining me today. It's great to catch up with you. And thank you to the rest of you for spending time with us as well. This has been a great conversation. And so until we see each other again, everybody stay well. Take care.